Hidden beneath Vatican City is a vault so secret that even world leaders have been turned away. No cameras, no catalogues, no entry, unless you already know exactly what you're looking for. Inside, they say, lie records that could rewrite history, trials that silenced scientists, letters that broke kingdoms, and gospels the church decided the world wasn't ready to read. This isn't legend, it's real. 50 miles of shelves, sealed behind steel doors and guarded by centuries of ritual. For over 400 years, these corridors have stayed locked. You can't explore them, you can't browse. If you don't already know what exists, you'll never see it. The Vatican calls it preservation. Critics call it control. Because when the most powerful religious institution on earth decides what parts of history the world is allowed to read, what else might still be hidden behind those doors? They call it the Vatican Apostolic Archive, but for most of history it had a different name. The Vatican Secret Archives. The word secretum in Latin doesn't mean mysterious, it means private, a place kept apart from the public. But that distinction never quite erased the feeling that something deeper was being hidden, and maybe that's because it is. Beneath the glittering chapels, the domes, the frescoes, under the weight of centuries of prayer and politics, runs a labyrinth of corridors cut into stone. Air so dry it stings the throat. Lights that hum like nervous thought. Each chamber lined with shelves of parchment and leather, the breath of 1,000 forgotten voices sealed behind glass. Down here, time doesn't move. It waits. The archive was first founded in the early 17th century under Pope Paul V. Back then, the Vatican was the center of an empire of the mind, a world where theology, science, art, and politics all knelt before the same throne. The popes understood the power of paper. Whoever owned the records owned the truth. And so they gathered it. Everything. Letters from kings and emperors, petitions from explorers, reports from missionaries describing lands no one in Europe had ever seen, minutes from councils that defined the boundaries of belief. Then, one day, they locked the doors. Only a few scholars were ever allowed inside, priests, historians, men of letters approved by the church itself. Even they were permitted to see only what they requested by name. And that's the rule that still defines the archive today. You cannot search for what you do not already know exists. It sounds almost poetic, a riddle of faith, but in practice, it is absolute control. If a document isn't catalogued in public records, no one outside the Vatican can even know to ask for it. A file can sit unread for centuries, invisible to history itself. Imagine a library that refuses to be read. Imagine walking through 50 miles of silence, each shelf another century of secrets, each label a name you'll never see. That's the paradox of the Vatican Archive. It is the most complete collection of human history ever assembled, and yet it functions as an absence. It exists not to reveal, but to withhold. Even scholars with credentials must submit formal requests for each individual item, the exact name, reference code, date, and author. If you guess wrong, if you ask for what doesn't exist in the catalogue, your request is denied, and the Vatican will not tell you what you should have asked for instead. The result is elegant and devastating. A structure designed not just to preserve information, but to filter it. At the deepest levels, the archives feel more like a military installation than a library. The air is regulated to the degree. The humidity never changes. Temperature sensors whisper their readings into a central system that never sleeps. Guards patrol intersections of corridors that no camera is allowed to record. Some say it looks like the inside of a bank vault. Others, like the underbelly of a cathedral. Both are true. Because down here, knowledge is both sacred and currency. Every door opens only for those with clearance. Every document is logged when it leaves its shelf. And yet, almost no one outside the Church's inner circle knows how many documents truly exist. Estimates range from 35,000 to 85,000 volumes, millions of individual pages, each one a fragment of the story of civilization. And yet less than 1% has ever been studied in detail. The rest remains untouched, a record of humanity's most powerful empire preserved, sealed, and kept in darkness. Why? The Church says it's about protection. Old paper is fragile, ink fades, vellum cracks in the air. That's the official reason. But preservation doesn't require secrecy. It doesn't explain the missing catalogues, the restricted access, or the fact that even heads of state have been denied entry. For centuries, emperors, presidents, and scholars have asked to see what lies below. Almost all have been told no. Napoleon tried to take it by force. During World War II, German officers requested access. Even in modern times, journalists and researchers have filed petitions. The answer never changes: access denied, because the Vatican's archive is not a library, it's a fortress. Up above, the city hums with faith and tourism. Pilgrims light candles, cameras click beneath the dome of St. Peter's. But under their feet, in that dense silence, lies the heartbeat of something much older and quieter. A centuries-long conversation between power and secrecy. You can feel it in the air, the weight of words that will never be spoken again, the ghost of letters that once decided the fate of empires. And maybe that's why the Vatican guards it so closely, because in those pages is not just history, but leverage. Letters from kings begging for mercy, records of wars, alliances and betrayals, decisions that shaped nations, sealed in ink and locked away forever. To open the archive fully would be to expose centuries of human politics woven through divine authority, the seams between faith and power, and maybe that's the real fear. Somewhere down there, beneath the frescoes and gold, in the narrow hallways where the air never changes, the Vatican keeps not only its secrets but ours, documents that could unsettle the official story of science, letters that might rewrite the birth of nations, texts that could question the foundations of religion itself, all of it behind locked doors, waiting for a question no one is allowed to ask. So the question becomes, what is the Vatican refusing to let the world see? Beneath the marble courtyards of Vatican City, the air begins to change. It grows cooler, denser, too clean to feel natural. The echo of the city fades, replaced by a mechanical hum, constant and low, like the steady breathing of a sleeping machine. This is where the surface world ends, and the architecture of secrecy begins. The Vatican's Apostolic Archive, once known as the Vatican Secret Archives, is not a single room or vault. It is an underground labyrinth, buried beneath centuries of stone, spreading in quiet lines beneath the world's smallest country. Few have seen it in its entirety. Fewer still understand how carefully it's designed, not simply to preserve knowledge, but to control it. Inside, the temperature never changes. Every corridor is climate-controlled, precisely regulated to protect fragile ink and parchment that could crumble under touch. The air carries no dust, no scent. Even the humidity is measured in decimals. Everything is stable, eternal, and carefully unnatural. The lighting is soft and indirect, gold-tinted tubes that hum faintly like insects trapped in glass. No sunlight has ever touched these pages. For centuries, the Vatican has kept them safe from the outside world and from the people who live in it. At the surface, the archive's main entrance hides behind an unmarked iron door within the Cortile del Belvedere, a Renaissance courtyard designed by Bramante. There are no signs, no maps. If you walked past it, you wouldn't even notice. But behind that door, a staircase spirals down, into the quiet. And with every step, you feel time reverse. The archives stretch an estimated 50 to 53 miles of shelving. To imagine that, picture the distance from Vatican City to the outskirts of Naples, all of it lined with files, letters, and manuscripts stacked in perfect order. Some corridors are narrow enough to brush your shoulders, others open into vault-like chambers with rolling ladders and walls of dark wood. Each shelf is numbered by hand, each folder sealed in protective linen, each item coded, catalogued. But only within the Vatican's internal system. There is no public index, no searchable list, no map of what exists down here. Even the Vatican Library, which shares the same complex, operates on a completely separate system. The archives are, by design, a maze without directions, a structure that only those within the Church can navigate. If a researcher is granted access, they do not walk through these corridors alone. They are escorted to a reading room above ground, where a guard and a librarian observe quietly from behind a desk. You cannot browse the shelves, you cannot explore, you cannot wander or even look around. To see a document, you must submit a formal written request, the exact title, author, and reference code. If the record exists, it may be delivered to your desk, carried by gloved hands from a place you will never see. If it doesn't, you will never know what you missed. It's a rule that sounds bureaucratic, but its implications are enormous. This system ensures that knowledge here can never be discovered, only retrieved, only confirmed. It's a design that transforms the archive from a library into a gate, one where the key is information itself. And the Vatican holds all of it. Now compare that to any major national archive on Earth. In London, the British Library holds over 170 million items. And yet anyone can walk in, browse catalogues, search digital databases, and request what they need. In Washington, the U.S. National Archives stores the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and millions of classified documents. But even there, the public can search, scroll, and ask. Some materials are restricted, yes, but their existence is never in doubt. You can know what you cannot see. In the Vatican, you cannot even know what exists to begin with. To the Church, this structure is an act of reverence. They call it the preservation of truth. Each document is sacred, not just as history, but as a testament to divine order. And in that theology of order, curiosity itself becomes a kind of sin. To seek without permission is to question authority. To browse is to doubt, and doubt here is dangerous. That is the philosophy built into the stone, the architecture of obedience. Every layer of this place enforces it. The walls, thick enough to survive bombings, ensure nothing leaks. The airlocks, separating chambers, ensure nothing contaminates. The guards, trained not in curation, but in vigilance, ensure no one steps beyond the path assigned to them. Even the silence feels intentional, a soundproofed reverence that discourages conversation. You don't speak here, you observe, you wait, and if you're lucky, you read. In the main archive hall, long corridors of rolling metal shelves disappear into shadow. Manuscripts are stored in crates the color of bone, each labeled with faded script: Latin, Italian, French. The handwriting itself is part of the architecture. Centuries of record keepers, popes, and scribes have left behind a physical map of authority written in ink. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the layers, the quills scratching, the footsteps of cardinals echoing above, the faint click of locks turning, the whispers of centuries folding back into one another. It's a place built not just to protect documents, but to remind you that you do not belong here. The Vatican doesn't use this system because it's practical. It uses it because it's effective. Control is most powerful when it feels natural. And down here, the control is architectural, a design of silence and stone that enforces submission without saying a word. Above ground, Rome glows with noise and color. Tourists moving in waves, priests and students filling cafes, the echo of languages from every corner of the world. Down here, that chaos is inverted. Everything is deliberate, minimal, contained. This is what secrecy looks like when it's perfected. Not frantic, not paranoid, but calm, clinical, almost holy. To stand inside the archive is to feel the weight of the past pressing outward. Every wall seems to hold its breath. Every corridor ends in shadow. Every shelf represents a decision. What humanity was allowed to remember, and what it was told to forget. And maybe that's why the Vatican has never digitized its holdings. No networked database, no remote access, no online records. In a world obsessed with openness, this one place remains analog, handwritten, hand-locked, protected by ritual instead of technology. It's a paradox as old as faith itself. To keep knowledge safe, you must keep it secret. But secrecy changes the knowledge it protects, because over time it stops being preservation and becomes power. 50 miles of silence, 50 miles of history that can't be seen, measured only by what's missing. It isn't just what the Vatican holds that matters, it's what it withholds. And in those locked corridors, somewhere between preservation and control, the line between truth and belief disappears. For centuries, the Vatican's archive has been sealed, a continent of history no one is allowed to explore. But a few pages here and there have drifted to the surface, documents that slipped through the cracks of time or were released only when they could no longer change what they once decided. These are the files we're allowed to see. Tiny windows into an ocean of silence. The first of them tells the story of a man who looked through a telescope and saw something the Church refused to believe. In 1633, the mathematician Galileo Galilei was summoned to Rome. It was observation. His crime wasn't violence nor heresy, at least not in the traditional sense. Through his telescope, Galileo had seen the impossible: moons orbiting Jupiter, shadows moving across Venus, proof that the Earth was not the center of creation. He published his findings in Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, a careful argument that dared to suggest the Sun, not Earth, was at the center. To most of us, that sounds like science. To the 17th century Church, it was treason against the cosmos itself. Galileo's trial transcript, still preserved in the Vatican archives, records every word of his interrogation. Each exchange is written in meticulous ink, his questions, his defenses, his exhaustion. There are even notes in the margins, added by inquisitors as they debated how severely to punish him. They accused him of vehement suspicion of heresy. He was forced to kneel, hand on scripture, and renounce everything he'd proven with his own eyes. Then they confined him to lifelong house arrest. For centuries, that transcript remained hidden, locked in the archives unread. The Church did not destroy it, it simply buried it. Only in the 19th century, when science had long surpassed theology, was the full record released, and by then Galileo had been dead for nearly 200 years. In 1992, 3.5 centuries after the trial, the Vatican finally admitted what the telescope had shown all along. Galileo had been right. The next document lies just a few shelves away. It begins with a plea and ends with the fracture of Europe. In 1530, King Henry VIII of England wrote to Pope Clement VII. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had failed to produce a male heir, and Henry demanded an annulment. His letter was formal, polite, and desperate. It was signed not only by Henry, but by nobles and bishops across England, each signature written in thick ink, pressing so deep into the parchment it can still be felt. That original document is still there today, kept in a climate-controlled chamber beneath the Vatican. It is not myth, it exists. The Vatican refused Henry's request, and in doing so it set off a chain reaction that would split Christianity in two. Henry broke from Rome, founded the Church of England, and ignited the Protestant Reformation across Europe. The letter, which once begged for mercy, became the proof of rebellion. For centuries, that petition remained unseen. It was not displayed, not discussed, until long after the Reformation had carved its new world. Only when its power to change anything was gone did the Vatican quietly acknowledge its existence. Further down the corridors lies another story, not of kings or science, but of art and the messy truth beneath genius. During the early 1500s, Michelangelo Buonarroti was at work on St. Peter's Basilica. To the world, it was a divine commission, the artist serving God through marble and paint. But his letters, preserved in the Vatican archives, tell a different story, one of exhaustion, debt, and resentment. He writes to Pope Julius II not with reverence, but frustration. He demands payment. He complains about delays, politics, the endless revisions and interference from cardinals. In one note, he writes simply, "I am not well paid, and I am not well treated." It is startling in its humanity, a reminder that even the creation of the most sacred structures was shaped by very human tension. For centuries, those letters were unseen, quietly filed away in drawers marked Corrispondenza Artisti. When they were finally revealed, they redefined how historians understood the Renaissance, not as divine inspiration, but as a negotiation between art, ego, and authority. Even beauty, it seems, required bureaucracy. The next set of documents carries us to a newer world. The year is 1863. The American Civil War has split a nation in two. On one side, President Abraham Lincoln writes to Pope Pius IX, asking for prayers, for compassion, for peace. On the other, Confederate President Jefferson Davis sends his own letter to the same Pope, seeking recognition of the Confederacy as an independent nation. The Vatican responded cautiously, diplomatically. To Davis, Pius IX sent a brief letter addressed to the illustrious and honorable President of the Confederate States. It was not an endorsement, but the Confederacy used it as a propaganda weapon claiming divine legitimacy. Both letters remain preserved in the archives, their ink faded but legible, the signatures real. They are proof that even in the modern age, the Vatican's voice could tilt the balance of global diplomacy. And again, these documents were only acknowledged after the fact. Long after the war was over, after the Pope's influence could no longer affect its outcome. The pattern repeats. Timing as power. Every revelation from the Vatican's vaults follows the same rhythm. Truth delayed until it no longer matters. Galileo's file, released when science no longer threatened faith. Henry's petition, displayed when the Reformation was irreversible. Michelangelo's letters, published when the Church could afford humility. Lincoln and Davis, shown only when both men were dust. Each time, the timing is surgical. Each release arrives not to challenge power, but to polish it. The Vatican never releases information when it's dangerous, only when it's safe. And that is the most consistent truth the archives reveal. Knowledge here doesn't flow freely. It trickles upward when the Church allows it, each disclosure carefully measured, each secret opened only after it has lost its ability to wound. The Vatican may speak of preservation, but in practice it preserves something else entirely: authority, control over time, control over narrative, control over the moment a truth becomes harmless enough to tell. What remains hidden, then, may not just be forgotten history. It may be the truths that still have the power to change everything. Every secret begins as a system. And in the Vatican, secrecy isn't an accident, It's an architecture, precise, deliberate, and almost beautiful in how quietly it works. Most people imagine the archives as locked doors and hidden rooms. But the real mechanism of control isn't the walls, it's the rules. Rules that turn curiosity into impossibility. Start with the simplest one. There is no catalogue, no public index, no master list, no searchable database that tells the world what's inside. The Vatican holds what may be the most complete collection of historical documents on Earth. And yet, to the outside world, it might as well be invisible. If you don't know a document exists, you can't request it. If you can't request it, you'll never see it. And because you'll never see it, no one outside will ever know it existed in the first place. That loop, awareness, access, disappearance, is what scholars call an information trap. A system designed to make silence self-sustaining. Once a document falls into that trap, it can remain buried for centuries. Not destroyed, not erased, just hidden in plain sight. Researchers who work with the Vatican describe it as a paradox. You can only request what you already know, but you can only know what you've already seen. The archives have no search bar, no open stacks, no browsing. Each request must be specific: title, author, date, reference code. That precision sounds scholarly, but in practice, it's a weapon. It means that 99% of the world's knowledge of these shelves depends entirely on what the Vatican decides to acknowledge. The silence becomes recursive. It protects itself. Then there's the rule of time. Every file, every letter, every memo is locked behind a rolling wall of decades. Some are sealed for 75 years after their creation. Only after that period expires may a scholar even apply to see them. That delay isn't about preservation, it's about control, because 75 years is longer than a political lifetime. It's long enough for everyone involved to die, for controversies to fade, for memory itself to soften. By the time the Vatican opens a file, its power to provoke is gone. It has become history, safe, quiet, and convenient. The Church calls it prudence, but in effect, it's temporal censorship. Time itself becomes the filter, the ultimate gatekeeper that ensures no revelation arrives while it still matters. It's a rhythm we've seen before. When Galileo's trial papers surfaced, the world had already forgiven science. When Henry VIII's letters appeared, the Reformation had already triumphed. When the Civil War documents were unveiled, the nations had already healed. The Vatican doesn't erase history, it edits when it's read. That timing is everything. By delaying access, the Church rewrites the emotional temperature of the truth. What might once have been outrage becomes curiosity. What could have been reform becomes reflection. Control the moment a fact is revealed, and you control how the world reacts to it. Even the language of secrecy was rewritten, a masterpiece of semantics designed to calm suspicion. For centuries, the name Vatican Secret Archives carried a charge of mystery. Secretum, in Latin, simply meant private. But the modern world heard something else, whispers of conspiracy, of forbidden knowledge, of hidden sins. And so in 2019, Pope Francis rebranded the archive. It would now be known as the Vatican Apostolic Archives. The change was framed as clarification, a move to dispel centuries of misunderstanding. Church officials assured the world that nothing had changed, that secretum had always meant privacy, not secrecy. But it was a linguistic sleight of hand, a cosmetic shift, not a reform. The locks stayed, the access rules stayed, the 75-year silence stayed. Even the scholars who had studied the archive for decades confirmed that nothing, not one barrier, had been lifted. The word changed, the walls did not. It was the perfect gesture, appear transparent without revealing a thing. By renaming the vault, the Vatican could posture as open while maintaining the exact same system of denial. To the public, the story became one of misunderstanding, not secrecy. A linguistic misunderstanding, not an institutional design. It's the same principle at work throughout the archive's history. Control the story, and you control perception. Control perception, and you control trust. Control trust, and you no longer need to hide. Every rule inside the archive reinforces the same idea. The Church decides when knowledge is sacred enough to speak. The public may believe in transparency, but the Vatican believes in stewardship. The belief that truth is not a right, but a responsibility, and only those deemed pure enough should bear it. That belief gives the archive its power. It justifies the silence, the delay, the denial. It turns secrecy into virtue. And over time it has become a habit, a rhythm so old that even those who enforce it no longer question what it protects. It's easy to imagine the archive as a relic of the past, a medieval holdover in a digital age. But that would be a mistake. This isn't superstition, it's strategy. It's how power maintains itself in a world obsessed with revelation. By refusing to compete in the marketplace of truth, the Vatican keeps its truths immune from time, untouched by public scrutiny, untethered from consequence. Every unopened box is a choice. Every missing catalogue entry is an act of design. The absence itself becomes control. When people ask why the Vatican keeps so much locked away, the official answer never changes. They speak of preservation, of fragile ink, of fading vellum, of the moral duty to protect history from decay. But fragility doesn't explain 75 years of silence. It doesn't explain the missing catalogues. It doesn't explain why a library built for knowledge functions like a confessional built for guilt. No, preservation is the excuse, control is the function. Beneath the Vatican, in the quiet corridors of the archive, the air smells faintly of wax and dust. Every shelf is a century, every box a locked question. But among the legends whispered by historians and heretics alike, none carry more weight or danger than the ones about the lost Gospels. Texts that were written, read, and revered long before the Bible became what we know today. Words once considered divine until the Church decided they were not. These are the voices cut out of Scripture, the other versions of Christianity that might have been. Discovered in 1945 near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, buried in a jar of sand sealed for 1600 years, the Gospel of Thomas begins without a story. No virgin birth, no miracles, no crucifixion, only a list of 114 sayings. Short, cryptic, almost like riddles. Jesus speaks not of sin, but of awakening. He says, "The kingdom is inside you and it is outside you." He tells his followers, "When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known." It is a gospel without suffering, a Christ who doesn't die for humanity, but instead invites each person to find divinity within themselves. To the early church, this was heresy. If salvation was personal, the institution that mediated between God and man lost its authority. And so the Gospel of Thomas vanished from public life, condemned, burned, or hidden, until fragments began to resurface in the 20th century. Today, some scholars believe a complete copy may rest deep within the Vatican archives, collected centuries ago, preserved quietly, but never acknowledged, because to release it would be to admit that Christianity once had more than one path to heaven. If Thomas questions hierarchy, the Gospel of Judas questions morality itself. Found in Egypt in the 1970s and kept hidden for decades, it presents a version of the Passion so strange that even scholars were hesitant to translate it. In this Gospel, Judas Iscariot is not the villain. He is the only disciple who understands Jesus' plan. When he delivers Christ to the Romans, he does so because Jesus tells him to. His betrayal is obedience. His sin is sacrifice. In the text, Jesus says, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." That single line, if accepted, undoes 2,000 years of Christian storytelling. It turns the symbol of treachery into faith, and it redefines the meaning of redemption itself. When the gospel finally became public in 2006, the Vatican responded carefully, acknowledging its existence but not its authority. Yet fragments suggest that older copies may have existed long before, likely acquired and locked away by church officials who feared its implications. Because if Judas was the chosen one, what does that make the rest of us? Somewhere between the known and the forbidden lies the Gospel of Mary. Written in the 2nd century, it tells of private teachings Jesus gave to Mary Magdalene, a disciple not of sin, but of wisdom. In this Gospel, Mary comforts the apostles after the crucifixion. She speaks calmly of visions and peace, teaching them what she learned from the risen Christ. But Peter challenges her. Did he really speak with a woman and not openly to us? The text breaks there, damaged, missing pages, and some, but what remains is clear, a power struggle over who gets to define the message of God. The early church buried this story because it was too dangerous. It suggested that the first leader of the Christian movement might not have been Peter at all. But Mary, in a faith built on male hierarchy, her gospel was an earthquake. For centuries, whispers have persisted that a complete version of this text exists in the Vatican archive, preserved but unacknowledged. Its presence an embarrassment to centuries of doctrine that painted her as a repentant sinner instead of a teacher. Because if Mary's gospel survived intact, it would prove something the Church has always feared, that the foundation of authority was never divine, it was editorial. Long before the time of Jesus, another text circulated among early believers, the Book of Enoch. It tells of angels who descended to earth, taught humanity forbidden knowledge, and fathered a race of giants. It speaks of cosmic battles, the structure of heaven, and the secrets of the stars. The New Testament's own letter of Jude quotes Enoch directly, proof that it was once considered sacred. But when church leaders gathered to formalize Scripture, Enoch was excluded. Its imagery was too strange, too apocalyptic, too filled with cosmology that blurred the line between heaven and something else. Some versions survived in Ethiopia, but in the West it vanished, its name spoken only in whispers among mystics and occultists. If the Vatican possesses a complete manuscript, it would be one of the oldest surviving depictions of angelic rebellion and divine technology, a bridge between faith and myth, and perhaps one reason it remains unseen. The Council of Nicaea, when heaven was edited in the 4th century as Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, its stories began to diverge. There were too many Gospels, too many interpretations, too many versions of God. So in 325 AD, Emperor Constantine summoned the Council of Nicaea, a gathering of bishops and scholars to decide which books would define Christianity and which would vanish. Out of dozens of competing texts, only 4 were chosen: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The rest, Thomas, Mary, Judas, Enoch, and many more, were declared heretical. Some were burned, some were hidden. Some, historians believe, were sent directly to the archives in Rome. The Bible that emerged was not the only possible truth. It was a decision, a vote. And from that vote, the Church became an institution. Faith became structure. Scripture became law. 2,000 years later, the Vatican still guards the consequences of that moment. Because if even one of those forbidden Gospels survived intact, if one full text from that lost library still waits behind those locked doors, it could unravel everything: the hierarchy, the priesthood, the claim of singular truth. Imagine a gospel where Jesus never dies, or one where the divine is feminine, or one where salvation requires no church at all. What happens to faith then? What happens to the power built on its silence? The church would call it blasphemy. Historians would call it history. And the faithful might call it freedom. But until the Vatican opens those doors, the truth, whatever it is, remains buried in that vast, cold quiet. A silence older than dogma and deeper than belief. For 2,000 years the Church has claimed to protect the faith. But faith is a fragile thing. It depends not on proof, but on the power of what cannot be proven. That is why, deep beneath the Vatican, alongside its forbidden texts, lie objects, not words, but things. Artifacts that touch the line between history and miracle. Objects too sacred to destroy and too dangerous to show. The spear of destiny and the weapon that drew blood from God, they call it the Holy Lance, or the spear of destiny, the weapon that pierced Christ's side as he hung on the cross. According to the Gospel of John, a Roman soldier, later named Longinus, used his spear to ensure the Saviour was truly dead. When the blade struck, blood and water flowed. From that moment, legend took over. The spear became more than a relic. It became a symbol of divine authority, said to grant victory to whoever possessed it. Charlemagne was said to have carried it in battle. So was Constantine. Centuries later, the Nazis sought it in Vienna, believing that whoever controlled it would command the fate of the world. Many copies exist, each claiming authenticity, but whispers have long said that the true lance was taken to Rome during the Crusades and hidden beneath the Vatican itself. The Church neither confirms nor denies. Its official stance is silence, but the few who have handled the spear displayed in St. Peter's note its odd features: a small iron blade encased in silver, split lengthwise, as if two versions were fused into one. Maybe that's just repair. Or maybe it's a disguise. Two relics merged to hide which is real. If the Vatican truly holds the original spear of destiny, then somewhere in its vaults rests the weapon that drew the final blood of Christ, an object that collapses faith into fact. And that perhaps is the reason it remains unseen, because faith thrives on mystery, but proof kills it. Long before Christianity, the Israelites carried a chest said to contain the 10 Commandments, the Ark of the Covenant. It was the most sacred object on earth, a vessel of direct connection with God. According to the book of Exodus, when the Ark led Israel's armies, enemies fell before it. When it rested, the presence of the Lord filled the air like fire, and then it vanished. Some say it was hidden before the Babylonian invasion. Others claim it was taken to Ethiopia, to a church in Axum where priests still guard a mysterious tabernacle no one but the high monk may see. But there is another story, one whispered among crusaders and chroniclers, that the Ark was found in Jerusalem by Templar knights and secretly transferred to Rome, not to be displayed, but to be buried beneath the church that would inherit its power. Historians dismiss this as myth, yet sealed within the Vatican's endless inventories are countless Crusader artifacts. Their provenance is redacted, their origins classified. If the Ark rests among them, its discovery would be the greatest revelation in history and the greatest threat to organized religion. Because the moment something once divine becomes measurable, it stops being miraculous. The Vatican's silence, then, may not hide the object. It may hide the choice to keep God unknowable. For centuries, pilgrims have climbed Mount Ararat in Turkey, searching for the remains of Noah's Ark. Some claimed to find wooden beams preserved in ice. Others brought back fragments, dark, tarred, ancient. Many of those fragments, according to church record keepers of the 17th century, were quietly sent to Rome for examination. No public results were ever published. Officially, they were dismissed as natural wood. Unofficially, some scholars believe they were stored. Too ambiguous to prove, too blasphemous to discard. To display them would be to invite science to test faith. To destroy them would be to erase a symbol of divine survival. So, the relics remain caught in the middle, sealed in darkness, waiting for a verdict that may never come. Because sometimes silence is easier than certainty. Not all relics claim the power to change empires. Some are quieter. The bones of saints, drops of blood sealed in glass, threads of linen said to have wrapped holy bodies. In the medieval world, relics drew crowds larger than kings. They were the currency of faith. A sliver of wood said to come from the true cross could attract thousands of pilgrims. A vial of holy blood could raise a cathedral. But over time, some relics began to trouble the church. Too many true crosses, too many holy nails, too many miracles that did not heal. So the Vatican began collecting the doubtful, the controversial, the inconveniently divine, quietly removing them from display, locking them away to protect both faith and reputation, because belief cannot survive too much evidence. And miracles, once explained, ceased to be miracles. Today, those sealed reliquaries sit in the lower vaults. Stone shelves marked only by number. No pilgrims, no prayers, no proof. All these relics, the spear that drew God's blood, the ark that carried his laws, the wood that weathered his flood, exist somewhere between the tangible and the sacred. To prove them would make the faith undeniable, but it would also end the need for faith itself, because faith is built on the space between knowing and believing. It lives in mystery, in that quiet, trembling distance between the human and the divine. That's why the Vatican hides them, not out of greed, not even fear, but preservation, not of objects, but of belief. The archives are not a museum of miracles, they are a tomb for certainty. Every relic sealed away keeps faith alive by keeping proof unseen. Because in the end, faith depends on belief. Proof can destroy it. Every civilization has its vaults, but the Vaticans may guard something stranger than relics or scripture, not miracles, not prophecies, but knowledge, the kind that doesn't fit neatly into history. In its lowest chambers, the Church is said to keep devices, maps, and manuscripts so far ahead of their time that to reveal them would shatter the idea of when humanity truly began to understand its world. This is the forbidden knowledge, the record of things that should not exist when they were made. Centuries before the Industrial Revolution, inventors and natural philosophers described wonders that defied their eras, clocks that tracked the heavens, mechanical birds that sang, automata that walked like men. Most of these tales were dismissed as myths, but fragments of diagrams and texts hint at something more. In the late 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci drew machines that wouldn't be built for 400 years. Flying craft, armored vehicles, hydraulic systems, all rendered in exquisite detail. The Church commissioned some of his work, then quietly confiscated others. Many of his missing sketches were never recovered. Some historians believe they were taken during the Inquisition, deemed mechanical heresy, the arrogance of man trying to imitate divine creation. If such pages survived, they would likely be resting in the Vatican's restricted collections, inventions too advanced for their time, proof that human ingenuity has always reached farther than permission allowed. The logic was simple and devastating. If a machine challenges faith in miracle, it cannot exist in the open world. Long before telescopes pointed skyward, ancient astronomers mapped the heavens with astonishing precision. Records from Babylon, Alexandria, and Persia describe celestial calculations accurate to the fraction of a degree, millennia before the invention of modern instruments. Among the rumors surrounding the Vatican's archives is the existence of bronze and crystal devices retrieved from missionary expeditions in the Middle East and Africa. Optical lenses, mirrors, and astrolabes capable of magnification and alignment that should not have existed in the eras they're dated to. A Jesuit report from the 17th century describes one such object, a lens of strange clarity found in a ruined monastery near Antioch, said to reveal the sun's blemishes when viewed through smoke. That description matches the function of a simple telescope, decades before Galileo built his own. The artifact was reportedly sent to Rome for further spiritual assessment. No record of it has ever been made public. If genuine, such a lens would rewrite the origin of the telescope and suggest that ancient optics, lost to war, conquest, and dogma, had reached levels of precision we've only recently rediscovered. Perhaps the most famous anomaly tied to Vatican rumor is not a relic, but a map. In 1513, the Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis compiled a world chart using sources he claimed were ancient maps from the time of Alexander. When rediscovered in 1929, scholars were stunned by what it showed. The coastlines of South America were drawn with near-perfect accuracy, decades before Europeans had charted them fully. Even more astonishing, at the map's southern edge lies a detailed outline of what appears to be Antarctica, not as a frozen wasteland, but as an ice-free continent. That single detail defies all historical logic. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, and it hasn't been ice-free for over 10,000 years. How could a 16th century admiral have mapped a world that no one of his time could possibly have seen? Piri Reis claimed his charts came from older sources found in libraries long since destroyed. He even referenced maps kept in the hands of infidels, a phrase that many historians interpret as referring to the Vatican itself. Could those infidel maps have been ancient charts collected by missionaries or crusaders, then locked away in Rome? If so, the Vatican may possess evidence that humanity's understanding of the world's geography predates all accepted history. During the age of exploration, thousands of missionaries were sent to the edges of the known world. They carried Bibles, yes, but they also carried notebooks. Their reports, filed through the Vatican, recorded not only conversions, but observations of the strange and unfamiliar, tribes with advanced star charts, ancient ruins with cut stone beyond local technology, machines carved into temples that seemed to show gears and wheels. Many of these reports survive only in fragments. Those that contradicted doctrine, that suggested other civilizations held divine knowledge, were quietly sealed. Letters from Jesuit explorers in South America mention metal birds carved in mountain stone and tubes that speak through wind. Such accounts were classified as metaphorical visions, but what if they weren't? It's not difficult to imagine what would happen if one of those explorers returned to Rome with a device, artifact, or text that defied the Church's timeline of creation. A strange machine that didn't belong to their world wouldn't be celebrated, it would be contained. The Church's mission throughout history was not only to spread belief, but to maintain order, cosmic, moral, and historical. Every discovery had to fit within that order. Anything that didn't, anything that implied knowledge predating divine revelation, was labeled heresy or miracle, depending on how useful it was. If it could reinforce doctrine, it became holy. If it could not, it vanished. And so the archives became a repository not just of truth, but of disobedience. A museum of things that proved humanity was more curious and more capable than it was supposed to be. Look at history and you'll see a pattern. Each time something appears that doesn't fit the timeline, a map, a device, a text, a fossil. It disappears into the vaults, sometimes under the label heretical, sometimes under unverified, always under controlled. Because the moment an artifact breaks the story we tell about ourselves, it becomes dangerous. The Vatican's greatest power isn't just in its faith, it's in its ability to decide what counts as history and what is quietly reclassified as legend. Perhaps the Church isn't hiding alien technology or ancient superweapons. Perhaps it's hiding something far simpler and more terrifying. Proof that humanity has been intelligent far longer than we remember. Because if that truth ever became undeniable, it would mean the story of creation, the foundation of divine uniqueness, was never as singular as we were told. And that is the one truth no institution built on faith can afford to let the world see. Every archive holds the past, but some say the Vatican's holds something else, not memory, but warning. Letters sealed by trembling hands, visions written in candlelight, predictions too heavy for daylight. Because if you believed the end was coming, would you tell the world or keep it quiet? It begins in Portugal, 1917. The sky over the village of Fatima burns with light. 3 children, Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta, stand in a field staring upward. Before them appears a figure the Church later identifies as the Virgin Mary. Over 6 months, the apparition returns, each time delivering a secret. The first 2 are revealed within decades. The third becomes one of the Vatican's most guarded mysteries. The first secret is a vision of hell, a warning to humanity about the price of sin. The second predicts the end of World War I and the rise of another, even greater war, if the world does not repent. The third, however, was different. Lucia, the eldest child, wrote it down in 1944. Her letter was placed in a sealed envelope, and in 1957 it was delivered to the Vatican, locked away, unread by the public. Popes would read it in private. Some reportedly wept. Others refused to comment at all. For more than 40 years, the third secret of Fatima remained hidden. Rumors filled the silence, visions of global war, the collapse of the Church, fire from the sky. In 2000, Pope John Paul II finally ordered it to be released. The Vatican published the text, a symbolic vision of a bishop in white walking through a ruined city filled with corpses before being shot by soldiers. Church officials claimed it referred to the 1981 assassination attempt on the Pope himself, but many refused to believe that was all, because the tone of the original witnesses, and those who'd seen the secret before its release, hinted at something darker. Cardinal Ratzinger, before becoming Pope Benedict XVI, once described the third secret as a great warning, not merely of physical destruction, but of spiritual catastrophe. And then there was Father Malachi Martin, a Jesuit scholar who claimed to have read the letter in 1960. When asked if it spoke of the end of the world, he paused and said quietly, "It would fill the confessionals for years." The Vatican insists the full text was published, but the witnesses who spoke of it before 2000 describe a version much longer, a second part that remains sealed. Some believe that missing section foretells not the fall of nations but the fall of faith itself, a world where the Church loses its soul from the inside out. Centuries earlier, another document emerged, one that has haunted Rome ever since. In the 12th century, St. Malachi, an Irish bishop, claimed to receive a vision during a pilgrimage to Rome. He saw the line of every pope that would rule until the end of the Church. He wrote down a series of short Latin phrases, one for each future pope, cryptic mottos describing their reigns. The list contained 112 in total. The first entries match astonishingly well. From the cross of Romulus, and for Pope Pius II, whose arms bore that symbol. From the half moon, for John Paul I, elected during a crescent moon. From the labour of the sun, for John Paul II, born during a solar eclipse, buried during another. Then the final line, the last pope. The prophecy reads, "In the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there shall sit Peter the Roman, who will feed his flock amidst many tribulations. When these are finished, the city of 7 hills will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people." If the list is genuine, then the current Pope, Francis, is the final name. The 112th. The Vatican dismisses the prophecy as apocryphal, but they have never denied it outright. And when Francis was chosen, he took a name no pope had ever taken before. Francis, the saint who renounced power, the shepherd of humility. To some, that was coincidence. To others, a quiet acknowledgement that the clock is nearly run down. Beyond famous prophecies lie the quieter ones, the sealed letters of visionaries, mystics, and saints. Throughout history, men and women claiming divine visions have written to the papacy, warning of plagues, wars, and cosmic signs. Most were ignored. Some were archived. A few whispered to have come true. In the 17th century, a nun in Spain wrote to the Vatican describing a vision of metal birds that breathed fire and carried death over cities. Her letter, reportedly sent to the Holy Office, was filed and forgotten. When airplanes dropped bombs over Europe centuries later, her words were quietly rediscovered and sealed again. During the Cold War, reports surfaced of correspondence between the Vatican and mystics in Eastern Europe, detailing dreams of nuclear fire and rivers that glowed blue in darkness. These too were locked away. If they exist, they would form a parallel record of history. Prophecies written before the events they describe. A chain of visions that, taken together, might tell a story the Church cannot afford to share, because to publish them would blur the line between divine revelation and coincidence, between theology and time travel. For the Vatican, prophecy is both danger and currency. A vision too literal becomes heresy. One too vague becomes superstition. The balance must be managed. By keeping these texts sealed, the Church controls not only what the faithful believe about the future, but when they are allowed to believe it. It is the same logic that governs the archives themselves, knowledge released only when it can no longer change the present. If the Fatima warnings, the prophecy of the popes, or the letters of the seers were all revealed at once, faith might collapse under its own panic. But maybe, just maybe, the silence isn't about control, maybe it's about mercy. Because if the archives truly contain visions of how the story ends, cities burning, seas rising, faith collapsing, then secrecy might be the Church's last kindness. After all, what would any of us do if we knew the date and hour of our own extinction? The Vatican says prophecy is faith, not fortune-telling. But somewhere in its vaults, in a drawer no one dares to open, the future may already be written. And every day the bells of Rome ring out across the city, their sound climbs the air, then falls again. A reminder that all things holy, all things human, and all things hidden move in cycles that always, inevitably, end. For most of human history, the Church has been the interpreter of the heavens. It named the stars, measured their movements, and wrote their meanings into the language of faith. But what happens when the sky begins to speak back? Beneath the marble domes of Vatican City, past the chambers of scripture and relic, there is another room, filled not with prayer books but with telescopes, a quiet contradiction at the heart of faith itself, a religion looking for God in the dark. The Vatican Observatory is one of the oldest astronomical institutions in the world, Founded in 1582 under Pope Gregory VIII, its first mission was not to explore the cosmos, but to fix the calendar. Easter was drifting out of sync with the seasons, and the Pope needed science to correct it. So began a partnership between heaven and mathematics. From that point onward, the Church maintained a quiet fascination with the skies, even as it silenced those who saw too much. Galileo's telescope had once been a threat. Now, centuries later, the Church owns telescopes of its own, some of the most advanced on Earth. One of them sits far from Rome, on Mount Graham in Arizona, a massive optical array cooperated by the Vatican, and one of its instruments bears a curious name, Lucifer. Officially, it stands for Large Binocular Telescope Near-Infrared Utility, with camera and integral field unit for extragalactic research. A mouthful of science, but the word itself, Lucifer, means light bringer. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe a quiet joke from astronomers who know that the search for light always begins in darkness. For centuries, the Vatican has collected reports of strange things seen in the sky, not miracles, not angels, just lights. Letters from medieval bishops speak of wheels of fire above monasteries. A 9th century manuscript from northern France describes a ship of shining brass hovering in the clouds for 3 nights. In the archives of missionary orders, there are accounts from the Americas, Africa, and Asia, each describing objects moving against the stars, glowing silently, departing without trace. To modern eyes, they sound like early UFO reports. To the Church of their time, they were categorized as signs, omens, portents, symbols of divine will. But quietly, methodically, Rome began collecting them, cataloguing them, filing them away. It is said that in the restricted archives lies a sub-collection known among archivists as De Coelestibus Miraculis, meaning of celestial wonders. Anonymously written, carefully indexed, its existence neither confirmed nor denied. What's inside remains speculation, perhaps nothing more than medieval imagination, or perhaps centuries of testimony describing the same phenomenon we are only now beginning to name. The idea that something other has visited Earth is not new. Even the Bible itself reads, at times, like an account of contact. In the book of Ezekiel, the prophet describes a vision. I looked, and I saw a storm wind coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning, surrounded by brilliant light. Within it were figures like living beings, each beside a wheel, intersecting a wheel. He writes of wheels within wheels, their rims full of eyes, and a sound like the roar of rushing waters. For centuries, theologians read it as metaphor, a poetic rendering of divine presence. But in the modern age, some scientists and believers alike have seen something else, an ancient description of technology, not angels, but machines. Elsewhere in Scripture, Elijah is taken into heaven by a chariot of fire. The Book of Kings describes it as a sudden light that lifts him into the sky. Across cultures, from Hindu texts to Mayan myths, there are echoes of the same image. Beings descending in brilliance, riding clouds, bringing knowledge and fear. If these are only metaphors, then humanity has always dreamed of flight. But if they're not, then our oldest religions may have begun as humanity's first attempt to explain visitors from beyond. And if that's true, then the Church's greatest secret may not be about God at all, but about who came before him. In recent decades, the Vatican's public stance on extraterrestrial life has shifted. In 2008, Father José Funes, director of the Vatican Observatory, gave a remarkable statement. Belief in the existence of extraterrestrial life does not contradict our faith. These beings would be part of God's creation. In other words, the Church was preparing for the possibility that we are not alone. Some call this openness progressive. Others call it preemptive, as if Rome knows something and is quietly softening the world for revelation. In the last 2 decades, as governments begin declassifying UFO files, the Vatican remains silent, neither dismissing nor confirming, only watching. Its telescopes continue to search, its scientists continue to map the heavens, and somewhere beneath those marble vaults, the old accounts of celestial wonders remain locked away, sealed by the same institution that once burned heretics for seeing too much sky. For centuries, the Church feared that looking too far outward would weaken faith. Now it seems to be doing the opposite. The deeper we search the cosmos, the more the mystery expands. And mystery, as the Vatican well knows, is the raw material of belief. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the stars were never forbidden, only misunderstood. Maybe every light we've ever called divine was both, a signal from above and a mirror of ourselves. Because perhaps the Church has realized that contact, if it comes, will not end faith. It will redefine it. After all, if the universe is infinite, so too must be creation. And what we call alien might simply be another expression of God's imagination, a different verse in the same eternal hymn. In that way, the Vatican secrecy makes a strange kind of sense. They're not hiding the stars, they're protecting the story until humanity is ready to hear it. We look to the stars for answers, but maybe the real question is older. What if heaven has always been closer than we thought? Power has always hidden itself underground. The farther back you look in history, the more you see the same pattern repeating. What's sacred, strategic, or destabilizing is buried, out of sight, out of reach, and, sometimes, out of time. The Vatican is not unique in this, it is only the most elegant example. Its marble facade hides the same instinct that drives pharaohs, emperors, and modern states alike. Protect the core. Conceal what secures your control. We begin, as all secrecy does, in stone. Beneath the deserts of Egypt lie chambers that have never seen daylight since they were sealed. In 2017, scientists used cosmic ray muon imaging to scan the Great Pyramid of Giza. What they found stunned the world, a vast, previously unknown void, 30 meters long, hidden above the Grand Gallery. No entrance, no markings, no record in any ancient text. Officials called it a cavity. Archaeologists called it preservation. But the truth is simpler and older. The pyramid was built not just as a tomb, but as a fortress of information. The pharaohs understood that power endures only when mystery survives. Even now, modern Egypt refuses to open the chamber. They say it could damage the structure. Maybe it could. But silence is easier to control than discovery. Sound familiar? The Vatican calls it preserving fragile documents. Egypt calls it protecting the pyramid. Different continents, same equation. What threatens authority is sealed in stone. Shift east. Beneath the mountains of central China, a network stretches thousands of kilometers, a subterranean labyrinth known as the Underground Great Wall. First revealed by defectors and satellite imagery, it is a system of tunnels built to conceal China's nuclear arsenal and command centers, a city beneath a state. Its purpose is not defense, it is continuity. If the surface burns, the power below survives. The same logic drives every great power. Visibility is vulnerability, secrecy is survival. And just like the Vatican's archives, these tunnels exist behind a language of necessity. Beijing calls them strategic infrastructure. The Church calls its vaults private archives. Both are correct, and both conceal something greater than what they admit. Now, north to the Ural Mountains of Russia. There, buried under granite, lies Mount Yamantau, a mountain with railways leading directly inside, sealed blast doors, and an official explanation that changes every decade. Food storage, mining operations, national reserves. No one outside Moscow knows for certain. Satellite imagery shows enormous excavation scars, ventilation shafts, and tunnel mouths the size of aircraft hangars. Western intelligence analysts suspect it is a continuity of government complex, a city built to outlive apocalypse. If the world above were to vanish, command would continue below. Sound familiar again? If heaven fell, the church would still endure underground. Rome's archives, Moscow's bunkers, Beijing's tunnels, each an echo of the same ancient impulse to preserve power, not life. From pharaohs to popes, from emperors to presidents, the structure is the same. The powerful always hide what secures their power, whether treasure, weapons, or truth. For Egypt, it was the afterlife. For China, the means of annihilation. For Russia, survival in nuclear winter. And for the Vatican, it is the narrative itself. Because the Vatican doesn't just guard relics, it guards meaning. The archives decide which stories live and which fade quietly into myth, which gospels become canon and which are condemned as heresy, which miracles are displayed and which are buried beneath the marble. The Church's vaults are less about preservation and more about curation. An editing of history so subtle and absolute that the world mistakes it for memory itself. The pyramids hid bodies, the Cold War hid bombs, the Vatican hides the timeline of humanity. What do all these vaults share? Not what they contain, but what they deny. Access, transparency, truth. To hide knowledge is to define it. To restrict it is to own it. That's the ultimate secret the Vatican learned, centuries before the world caught up. Power doesn't depend on armies or gold. It depends on narrative control. And control is never shouted. It's whispered, filed, sealed. Every empire writes its story twice, once for the people and once for the vault. The first is history. The second is truth. Look at them side by side, Rome, Giza, Beijing, Yamantau. Each built on a foundation of stone and silence. Each ruled by men who understood the same law. Visibility invites challenge. Secrecy ensures control. That's why the Vatican's archives still matter. Not because of what's in them, but because of what they represent. The blueprint of power itself. The cathedral and the bunker are the same structure, built for different gods. When you stand inside the Vatican archives, the air hums with refrigeration and quiet tension. Files breathe faintly in their boxes. Every corridor is a reminder that truth is not lost, it's managed. And if history feels incomplete, that's because it's meant to. The Vatican doesn't just guard relics, it guards narrative control. The pyramids kept their dead safe from decay. The modern world keeps its weapons safe from light. The Vatican keeps the story of humanity safe from itself. The powerful don't bury secrets because they're evil. They do it because control is fragile. Because to hold power over the present, you must own the past and shape the story of the future. In the end, every sealed vault, every hidden chamber, every classified archive tells the same story. The truth was never destroyed. It was simply buried where only power could reach it.